I would like to welcome all honourable senators and members of the public who are watching this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, either here in the room or listening via the web. I would like to acknowledge, for the sake of reconciliation, that we are meeting on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin peoples. My name is Lillian Dick from Saskatchewan, and I have the honour and privilege of chairing this committee. I will now invite my fellow senators to introduce themselves, starting on my right with the Vice Chair.
Good morning, Scott Tanis from Alberta.
Good morning, Norman Doyle, Newfoundland and Labrador. I keep forgetting.
Nancy Greenrain from BC.
Pate from Ontario. Nancy Hartling from New Brunswick.
Dan Christmas, Nova Scotia.
Patrick Brazo, Quebec.
Mary Lou McFedrin, Manitoba.
Thank you, Senators. Today, we continue our study on what a new relationship between the Government of Canada and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada could look like. Today, we are really excited and honored to hear from the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. We have before us Sharleen Gale, the Chair of Fort Nelson First Nation, Nilo Edwards, Executive Director, Mr. Willie Blackwater, Director, Gitsukua Band Council, Jackie Thomas, member of the Saikoots First Nation. I hope I said that correctly. And from the First Nations Financial Management Board, we have Mr. Howard Calla, Executive Chair. Thank you for appearing before us this morning. I understand that you have some opening statements to be followed by questions from the senators. We are going to test drive on you today our phase 2 of our study, where we're asking you to think in general terms of what a nation-to-nation relationship could be. And we are distributing, I think, a list of general questions to the senators. So if you would like to begin. And who's going to go first? Ms. Gale?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Honourable Senators. I have the privilege to serve as Chair of the First Nations Major Project Coalition. I want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. With me today are two members of the coalition, Chief Willie Blackwater from Getsakutla First Nation, who also serves as a coalition director, and Chief Jackie Thomas from Saikoots First Nation. I'll be sharing my time with Chief Blackwater and Chief Thomas so they can speak about our work from a perspective of their communities. Also with us is the coalition executive director, Nilo Edwards. Mr. Edwards oversees the coalition's technical work and can elaborate these points should you have any questions of that nature. Sitting behind us are our lead technical team. They are members of their respective nations. They are educated in their expertise, and they are key to the coalition's success. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the support the coalition has received from the First Nations Financial Management Board in providing the guidance and support necessary to make our work a reality. The coalition is able to provide capacity support to 37 First Nations in British Columbia because we were able to leverage the support of the purpose of the Fiscal Management Act to do the work. As a First Nation leader, I want to thank the Senate and your committee for its historical support to ensure this legislation became law in 2005. Please know the purpose of the Fiscal Management Act are making a difference at the community level for those who are using those services. The existence of the coalition is one example. The capacity building effort of the coalition are equipping First Nations with the knowledge and tools necessary to arrive at informed decision making, especially concerning the management of the wealth that lies within their traditional territories. From a policy perspective, this work represents First Nation-led action on what the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People means to our communities concerning major project development. Article 4 of the Declaration is tied to the right to self-determination and the means by which we finance our autonomous functions. We cannot have self-determination without the means to finance our government, our services, our programs for our membership, and to build the local economies necessary to correct our massive infrastructure deficits. We have to start a serious conversation around the access to capital and about the provisions of government loan guarantees for First Nations to participate in major projects. My community knows that transfers from MINAC will never be able to bridge the social, economic, and infrastructure gaps. Our communities know the economic drivers can be found by unlocking the wealth within our territories to our benefit. Directly connected with the building of economies necessary for self-determination is Article 29 of the Declaration, which the details of the right and duty of Indigenous people have in the conservation and protection of the environment. These two articles are linked. You cannot have a strong economy for long if you do not protect the environment. Canada's environmental laws must change to enshrine First Nations into the decision-making process. The work of the Coalition is equipping First Nations to take hold of the UNDRIP provisions of the rights to First Nation decision-making on the resource projects in First Nation territories. Here in Ottawa, we need recognition that this work is important, and as innovative policy mechanism decided here must include Indigenous peoples. In my view, we see innovation being championed at the political level in a good way by Minister Wilson-Raybould in some of her recent policy announcements. This includes her government's 10 principles respecting Canada's relationship with Indigenous people, and her previous work as BC Regional Chief in the place on advancing initiatives like Bill S-212 as a tool to move beyond the Indian Act. That bill was tabled a number of times in this place by former Senator Jerry St. Germain, who today at 80 years old continues to volunteer his time to help the Coalition with our work. In closing, I want to acknowledge the resources provided to the Coalition by Canada through the Strategic Partnership Initiative and to support our work from the Minister Philpott and Minister Carr. Canada needs to continue to invest in First Nation-led capacity building initiatives like the work of the Coalition in order to get to a pace where shared decision-making can be made in a way that truly represents the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. This is what the work of the Coalition is all about. And I thank you, and I would like to turn over the table to Chief Blackwater.
Amahiru. Thank you, and good morning, Honourable Senators. I am Chief Willie Blackwater from Gayuko First Nation. I'm elected Band Chief and also carry the hereditary name of Shamogat Chiwish, a member of the Wolf Clan from the House of Chabuch within the Gitchan Nation. I have the privilege to serve as a director for the Major Project Coalition. I will pick up my remarks where Councillor Gale left off. Through the work of the Coalition, our communities are building knowledge to seek access to capital required to realize on project ownership and self-sufficiency and self-determination. We are discussing best practices for benefit sharing, wealth management, and building financial literacy. We are developing a common approach to environmental stewardship a toolkit of measures and the standards that First Nations can use to access project impacts and mitigation according to our interest and values. Not only are we providing action to the UN Declaration, we are also advancing the principle of reconciliation, which I will speak to more in a moment. My community of Gitchigooka has a history of being in and out of intervention for a number of decades. I was first elected chief in 2015. Since then, my council and I have agreed to work together for the benefit of our community to turn our financial state around. We did this by agreeing to view our third-party manager and INAC as partners, not as our adversaries. Around this time, Gitchigooka joined our Major Projects Coalition. It was because of our involvement in the coalition that I met Harold Calla and the Financial Management Board. The services of the Financial Management Board have become a partner to Gitchigooka's success, along with INAC and our third-party manager. Gitchigooka was able to use the additional tools of the Fiscal Management Act to get out of third party, and we're now working to stay out of it permanently by developing a financial administrative law. The true definition of reconciliation can be realized when partnerships are forged with our First Nations communities in order to advance our economic and social standing. The work of the First Nation Major Project Coalition is, in my view, an example of an act of partnership with Canada. That is advancing reconciliation by raising our standing through the building of capacity necessary to get into business. And I speak from a position of experience and authority on reconciliation. I am the named plaintiff who advanced the Blackwater court case on behalf of those like me who suffered the atrocities of Indian Residential School, fought the government, and won. Today, all adversaries have become partners. Honourable Senators, that is the true definition of reconciliation. I want to thank you for listening. I will turn the floor over to Chief Thomas for the final word.
Thank you, Chief Blackwater, and thank you, Honourable Senators, for this opportunity to appear. Masi ni algonkin keo tebe hunzu. I'm Chief Jackie Thomas from Sycus First Nation. Our territory is located west of Prince George, British Columbia. Councillor Gale and Chief Blackwater made points about how the work of the Coalition is providing First Nation-led action on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and how this work is advancing the ethic of reconciliation. I will speak from a more hands-on approach, and as a leader of a community that is receiving capacity support from the Coalition to explore the advancement of a major hydroelectric project called the Kenny Dam Water Release Facility. Sycus, along with 3 of our impacted neighbours, Stelaten, Natlewaten, and Chislata Carrier Nation, wrote to the Coalition Board of Directors requesting the capacity and technical support necessary to explore this project opportunity. We are the first to road test the Coalition's project identification and capacity support process. This process, developed and adopted by the Coalition membership, represents the criteria necessary to assess major projects based on social and economic factors that are truly First Nation influenced and designed. As part of this process, our communities and the Coalition have signed the terms of reference, outlining our relationship to explore this opportunity. We, as the communities, lead our interest in the project, both from a political and business perspective. The Coalition equips us with the necessary capacity supports required to inform our decisions concerning the economic and environmental implications of this project. We are able to access these services from the Coalition free of charge because of the resources provided by the government. If we had to pay for this level of service out of the BAN resources, we would likely not afford to do it on our own. The project itself would have many benefits to our communities that go far beyond economic components. The proposed water release facility would reclaim significant environmental damage to a portion of the Nechako River that was made dry due to industrial impacts in the 1950s that were done without consultation nor accommodation. Because of the installation of the Kenny Dam, the burial grounds of the Chislata Carrier Nation to this day flood in years when there are high water levels. This causes repeated social hardships on that community. For Saikas, Dalaten, and Notley-Witen First Nations, the installation of the dam has impacted our salmon stocks and our way of life. We want the opportunity to correct these historic damages. We want the opportunity to strengthen our economy at home so we can pay for our housing, infrastructure, and other needs of our membership. This particular project has been talked about for many years in our communities. In closing, I want to share with you that it isn't often that multiple First Nations communities are able to set aside our differences and work together to pursue our business interests. A lot of credit is due to the non-political and business-focused resources that the Coalition has provided to our communities that enable us to work together. My involvement with the Coalition has been meaningful and has provided early success at achieving objectives. As First Nations, we need our own capacity supports to engage in the same way that other orders of governments do every day. The Major Project Coalition represents a capacity vehicle that is needed if there is going to be a new collaborative or inclusive way of dealing with the interests of our communities. We all share in the responsibility for tomorrow, and we are all in this together. Thank you for listening and for this opportunity to present to you.
Okay. Mr. Callan?
Thank you, and honourable senators, it's a pleasure to be back. And it's nice to see Senator Watt here. I was reminded coming down that it was 20 years ago that I first came to Ottawa to appear before the Senate Committee on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples at the invitation of Senator Watt. And little did I know what he started through that invitation. We hear a lot of conversation with this government about resetting a nation-to-nation relationship. What does that mean? Where do we begin? Nation-to-nation, I think, has to start with recognition. Then we'll get reconciliation. But recognition of Aboriginal rights and title. Recognition of some of the Supreme Court of Canada decisions that have come down. But just as importantly, we need to recognize the need for First Nations to have access to an administrative capacity and structures that allows First Nations to engage with Canada on a level playing field. The path to reconciliation must start with enabling and investing in building governance capacity. It is in Canadians' interest that First Nations have the knowledge and confidence to engage in the opportunities being presented by this government. Closing the socioeconomic gaps, increasing self-sufficiency, accessing capital, and creating First Nation institutions to support communities as the Department of Indigenous Services sunsets are all reasons to build administrative capacity and structures necessary to respond to the TRC recommendations, the principles of UNDRIP, and the principles recently articulated by the Government of Canada. The Major Projects Coalition is an example of the type of support that Canada needs to invest in to bring to life the UN Declaration, a new fiscal relationship, and a true nation-to-nation relationship through a recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights. The firm commitment by this government to recognize and non-extinguish Aboriginal and treaty rights will contribute to a reconciliation efforts underway and will support expanding the Canadian economy in ways that enables the sharing of benefits of this economic growth. I want to talk next about fiscal relations, because the efforts by this government to a new nation-to-nation relationship has recognized the need for a new fiscal relationship. I suggest to you that funding arrangements, while an important aspect of operationalizing fiscal relations, is not in of itself the basis of a new fiscal relationship within a nation-to-nation relationship. Embracing and enabling the exercise of First Nation jurisdiction by making room for First Nations at the fiscal table, similar to the principles that guide the fiscal relationship between Canada and the provinces, is a way to do that. The government has engaged in a series of meetings with the AFN on a new fiscal relationship. These have been described as exploratory tables. I understand a draft report will be tabled with the chiefs at AFN meetings in the next couple of days. The fiscal institutions, the First Nation Financial Management Board and the Tax Commission and the Finance Authority, were invited by First Nation leadership in British Columbia to support a regional process to discuss fiscal relations. The discussions led to a resolution for British Columbia identifying the principles of a new fiscal relationship based upon the recognition of First Nation jurisdiction. The principles suggested the need to share tax room, jurisdiction over content and eligibility of programs and services, and to a need to include the provinces at the fiscal table. There have been conversations between the department and the fiscal institutions created under the Fiscal Management Act on how to leverage the existing transfer system to use the tools of the Fiscal Management Act to consider long-term funding arrangements that could result in greater and broader outcomes. First Nation leadership in British Columbia supports a regional process. They support the national table. But I think we also need to understand that the historical perspective that Indians are a program has to change. If we're governments, then we need to be empowered as governments as other orders of governments are empowered. What we need to build to be successful in this initiative are First Nation institutions that match the kind of institutional support the Government of Canada and you get in this department. The only thing that is certain at this time is that the amount of resources that are going to be needed to bridge the socio-economic gaps is substantial, and we're going to need multiple sources of revenues to achieve that goal. I want to next talk about infrastructure. The Senate has studied the infrastructure gap that First Nations are facing, and your report provided some observations on opportunities to address the situation. The Fiscal Management Act institutions have proposed the creation of a First Nations Infrastructure Institute under the Fiscal Management Act, and to place all aspects of infrastructure procurement, operation, and maintenance under the institution. This would permit monetization of existing resources, including a community's own source revenue, and to look at alternative procurement models, including the bundling of projects and public-private partnerships. This initiative would build on existing regional approaches that have been developing over the last few years. Regional delivery of services could provide administrative capacity lacking and better manage cost and completion risk. A First Nation institution could develop national standards and support a local capacity needed to implement and maintain standards. Now, in order to successfully transition to a new nation-to-nation and a new fiscal relationship, we can't ignore the challenges that are being faced by many communities who are in some form of default management intervention. Soon after this government was elected, Minister Bennett spoke to the Financial Management Board and requested that we look at options to improve the existing default management program being utilized by her department. The experience of this program saw many communities remain in default management for long periods of time, in some cases decades, And there didn't seem to be the opportunities or incentives that would see communities improve their affairs and exit the default management program. The Financial Management Board's view was that we needed to invest in these communities, build the necessary capacity to develop appropriate governance, financial management, and human resource policies, and to establish procedures that allow them to develop community plans that respond and give hope to their communities. And I want to focus on the hope part of that comment. We need to provide the tools and the opportunities and the support for communities to have hope that they have a future that's beyond the status quo. I think that the old approach penalized communities. It took away discretionary funding and it didn't invest in their capacity development. A pilot project was developed in cooperation with the department and the minister that saw one community in British Columbia, Willie's community, and 4 communities in Manitoba become part of a pilot project. Our approach was to use the certification process of the Financial Management Board to move beyond the status quo. What we've been doing is building the necessary tools and capacity to manage the affairs of the community and working with the community on the ground in the community. It is driven by chief and council. It is optional. And when we are able to feel that they are capable of having the capacity in place, then they are in a position where many different opportunities are open to them. The project is working. There was a community in Manitoba. I got a phone call from the chief. He was very emotional. Apparently it was the first time in 2 decades that they were out of third-party management because they had committed to the process and done it. But there are some issues that are starting to arise with everything. And these are not to be criticisms of anybody or any department or any position. They're just the reality that when you start to unearth things, you find things, okay? The role of INAC regional offices and how they interact with headquarters needs to be reviewed as the program moves beyond the pilot project stage. It is becoming clear that an Indigenous support services entity would achieve economies of scale and provide services not otherwise available to all communities. The one thing that we have learned over the last couple of years through the Major Projects Coalition is the benefit of providing an opportunity for multiple First Nations to have access to capacity that they would not otherwise have. And I think we need to expand on that concept in a more broad way to provide services to communities. Now, there are some communities who will not need those kinds of services, but we have many smaller communities across this country who could benefit from capacity and expertise, just as those communities along the major project corridor have been able to do. I think the move to consolidate Indigenous services under one ministry is welcomed, but there needs to be a quick transition so that there is harmony in the application of policy between different ministries. This has become evident in the challenges those communities in the pilot project have faced when dealing with multiple departments like health and Indian affairs. All of these matters are being recognized and we are beginning to look for solutions. I think that everyone who is impacted, and all Canadians are impacted by the Aboriginal file, need to understand that the status quo, accept that the status quo does not work, that fundamental change has to take place. It has to be based on recognition. It has to be based on the principles that underlie the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It has to understand that investments have to be made both in governance and in economic development opportunities. It needs to be recognized that First Nations need to have their jurisdictions recognized and need to have a place at the table where decisions are being made around major project developments in our country. And we need to find ourselves in a position where we have reliable and stable sources of income so that our communities can plan like other orders of government can plan and not be dependent on 12-month cash flow funding that comes through contribution agreements as it exists today. A new fiscal relationship does involve new transfer arrangements, I agree. But those transfer arrangements need to come from a different source than necessarily entirely parliamentary appropriations from the Department of Indian Affairs. We need to expand our jurisdictional authority to raise revenue and source in our traditional territories. If we can do those things, we will be able to achieve success. And the one thing I want to implore upon you is there is an urgency to this. These are not uncomplicated matters. And there will be a temptation to study it to death. We need to act. There is an urgency in our communities for us to act. And we need to have the tolerance that there will be some challenges in the implementation of this new strategy. You cannot hold this initiative to a standard higher than you hold other initiatives of government to. And what I'm saying politely is that there may be some missteps, there may be some things that we have to fix. And the first sign of that, we can't throw up our hands and say, see, I told you, they can't manage it. First Nations taking control of their own destiny through institutions is the approach that we need to adopt as an implementation tool for a new nation-to-nation relationship to implement UNDRIP and the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, panel members. We'll now start our first round of questioning, starting first with our Vice Chair, Senator Tanis, to be followed by Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Chair. I recall when the Major Projects Coalition first became aware of it, and it would have been maybe 2 years ago. And I think that if I remember right, there were really two things that were very powerful in the presentation at that point. One was the story of the missed opportunity of a First Nation to participate in a major pipeline project, because there was no program to finance their participation, and therefore they lost that opportunity. And to me, that was a brilliant, clear, obvious lesson. The second was this idea of communities having the capacity to, by themselves, without the help of the promoter, assess a project independently and to prepare for discussion and negotiation and so on, and a decision as to whether or not that project could benefit the community and in what ways, or what issues there were around it. And that, if I remember right, at the time, reading some of the background materials around the UN Declaration, and especially the article around consent, and this was talked about as being a cornerstone of that article of declaration, is the idea that capacity has to be built so that the informed part happens. We're 2 years on. You've given some examples now of where the coalition has actually been in and helped the communities on the capacity building side. Has there been any opportunity? Has there been any? So it sounds to me like that is going well, and that there's some effort and some resources being put towards that. What about on the other side, on the partnership side, on the development of some economic muscle that could be brought to bear to allow partnerships from communities? How has that developed over the last couple of years?
If I might start, having worked with this group for that period of time, I think Canada found itself in a very difficult circumstance 2 years ago when the commodity prices tanked. And I would dare say that we missed the opportunity by not getting ourselves organized sooner. So those major initiatives that were being contemplated at that time the proponents found themselves not abandoning but stepping back for a period of time until there was some political certainty in the provincial government's front and the federal government's front. And there was some clear economic indications that these projects were going to be viable. We're starting to recover from that process now. And there is some apparent interest in some of those initiatives being initiated again. I think we're now in a position where people understand that there is a major projects coalition, that they are working, and that they can come to the Major Projects Coalition and get some response to opportunities that might be considered at the time. There is an initiative on the Kenny Dam Water Release Facility, which is about a $350 million project, that will road test some of this. How do you finance it? How do you deal with the environmental assessments, all of that process? The reality of First Nations not having a balance sheet, as I refer to it, by virtue of not being able to generate the wealth from their traditional territories, is a reality that doesn't go away until such time as we have access to the resources in our traditional territories and can accumulate a balance sheet. So there's going to continue to be a need for support for First Nations to acquire an economic interest in many of these things. That matter is unresolved in terms of where is Canada's place in a new nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations? There are many examples in this country, and I've discussed them here previously, between CMHC, other specific projects, some who have worked out well, some who have not, where Canada has recognized its important role as a government to step in and provide the fiscal and financial leadership to establish an economic agenda and support that. That might be the case here, where First Nations are looking for opportunities to participate in equity positions in First Nations. I think there is an appetite on the part of the business community to include First Nations, but First Nations are going to have to pay for any equity position that they might be able to negotiate in these relationships. And that matter remains unchanged, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the panel? Excuse me. Or will there be any other comments from the panel? Chief Gale?
Sorry, Madame, it's Councillor Sharleen Gale.
Councillor, sorry. I just you.
I'd like to answer the question, Senator, in a way of the coalition's work, how it has brought First Nation communities together in partnerships, and to look at the big picture and the reality that our nations face on a daily basis. We're very fortunate to live on our lands and to have our elders guide us. But throughout the years, there has been many fights on traditional territory and those kind of things. But through the membership, it's been so wonderful to see communities come together for their nations to find a project and to be able to work on it, to bring prosperity to their communities, and something more beyond than just jobs. So the hope is well and alive. I really believe in the work that the coalition is doing and that we are doing as the board of directors. I see a lot of hope for the future. And with our wide range of membership throughout the province, it's really brought us all together to share our stories and share our experiences and learn from each other. But it also opens our eyes to know that working with others is a good thing, especially when it comes to your local municipality. There's many things that working together can do for communities, and it's important that no matter where we're from, we all work together. And so the dream is alive, and we're very optimistic. And with the coalition's work, I see a future for future generations. So, must see.
Thank you.
We'll now turn to Senator Patterson, to be followed by Senator Rain.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's great to have you folks before our committee. I think it's really timely because Canada's talking about the new nation-to-nation relationship. And as you know, our committee is studying that very question. And fiscal relations is a key part of this discussion, clearly. We are to report in about a year. And we are, or at least I am thinking about the life of this government. We need to make some concrete recommendations that can help push this exciting process that you're talking about. I think we're in a position to be influential. I hope we're in a position to be influential. You talked about some really exciting concepts. You know, it's basically about building capacity as INAC sunsets, I think was what you said. This is how we get rid of the Indian Act. You know, and you talked about an infrastructure institution to better manage capital projects. You know, we've been in the field. We have seen how capital projects have been botched with our own eyes. Delays in poor communication from regional offices. You talked about long-term financial arrangements to monetize the funds that we know will be coming, more than year to year. And then levering that to develop capacity to raise own revenues. I guess my real question is this. You know, you talked about the AFN developing principles of a new fiscal relationship. We got to get beyond principles fast. So, I think. So, and as you say, we can't study this thing to death. So, I guess here's the tough question. What concrete recommendations can we make in what areas to push this agenda along? I know you're interfacing with the government intensively, and I appreciate your efforts very much. How can we, what are the areas we should focus on? What should we be recommending in our report to make a big difference in this relation and move your agenda forward? What are the key areas that can be moved on?
I feel like I'm writing out my Christmas list here. It's a great question, Senator. I think that the work that the AFN is doing on creating stable, predictable funding is an immediate short-term win that needs to be encouraged. I think the ability to establish long-term funding arrangements and the ability to monetize those funding arrangements under certain terms is an important step to move forward right now. Those steps could have an immediate impact on First Nations if they were implemented within the next fiscal year or two. Beginning to plan is important. Continuing to support, as we have had support since 2007 from government in the Fiscal Management Act institutions to develop capacity. I think we have proven through the 220 some odd First Nations who are scheduled to the Act the 100 that we've certified and the 100 that we're working on, and the ability of the Finance Authority to raise over $400 million in New York in debentures to support First Nation loan requests has proven the success of a First Nation-led and developed approach to these matters. I think that that has to become a cornerstone of the approaches that are being followed, and your recommendations I would respectfully suggest, need to reflect that. Develop First Nation institutions, allow those institutions to take over the opportunities that are being presented, and to have those institutions First Nation-led. I think that's going to be absolutely critical. I think you also have the opportunity to comment on the need for recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights. I believe at times that the quantum of reconciliation that's going to be required is so significant that it frightens people away from even beginning to talk about it. And we have to get past that. There is not going to be an ability for First Nations to table a bill with you and have you look at paying it. It's not about money. Reconciliation, you can never achieve with money what needs to be achieved in the recognition of our Aboriginal rights and title and our ability to have jurisdiction. And that means that all federal government departments, from NRCan to Environment to Finance to Treasury Board to Indigenous Affairs and the Crown Ministry, they all need to be embraced. There has to be a harmony within government departments that I don't see existing today. And if you were able to listen to the Auditor General's comments at the Institute on Governance meeting last week in the city, understand what he was saying. That politically, governments are able to develop policy, and they can move much more quickly than bureaucracy has demonstrated an ability to move. And our biggest challenge is going to be that, I suggest, is how do you move a structure that's been in place since Confederation and has had a paternalistic relationship with Indians in this country, and how do they embrace the concept of self-determination and a transition of not only authorities but operations to First Nation-led institutions. If there's one thing that you're going to have to be aware of, is the need for that transition to be observed and monitored.
One of the key things that I answer to your question is that from Gajuka's perspective, is that initiatives like the major projects do give us hope. We thought, and our previous leadership have always thought, that we would be stuck in poverty, no resources, and that we'd be held hostage in a third-party environment forever. But when you get access to resources at no cost, it helps our people move beyond. When you live in a community, I live in my own community. When you live in a community where you have 2 or 3 families in a home because of no funds to build houses and stuff like that, that's one of the most devastating. That's even worse than residential school. I am a residential school survivor. And when we look at the major projects, and it's not about just funding a project, it's about access and resources without charge, sharing that resources freely. Those are the things that help us. And in our community, 85% minimum are on social assistance. And we have a hemp license, I think one of the rare ones in BC. So when we start looking and we start planning, we can be self-sustainable with a hemp license, and we get then we have a gravel pit and other economic development to move forward with. When you talk about removal of the Indian Act, we need to be ready for that. We need to be self-sustainable, and I know just in the short years that I've been chief, that we have the ability to do that because we've let go of our differences and work together as partners. So thank you for your question. It's been on my mind for a long time, and that's my passion as a chief, as a leader for Gijuka, is to help them build and expand. But in order to do that, we have to have our own source of revenue. And then our lives, our community lives, and our children's lives will be a lot better. Thank you.
Comments from the panel? Councillor Gale.
Throughout many of our lives and past elders and so forth and leaders in my community, there has been many opportunities that have arisen. But without access to capital or a federal loan guarantee, those realities have never come to fruition. And that's where I see is the biggest opportunity is if First Nations could own and build infrastructure, major infrastructure that would have a huge influence and significance to Canada and our economy, would make the greatest difference ever. I talked about not just providing jobs. For Fort Nelson First Nation, we're one of the biggest employers in our community. And we're very proud of that because we're able to provide employment to many people and many families, not just our own people. And many people have come across Canada to come work for us. We really encourage our members to be strong, healthy, proud, self-reliant people. And we want them to be able to take care of themselves and their families and the future generations. So it's beautiful when you can see a young family mortgaging their own home on the reserve. It's nice when you can drive on a community and the roads are paved and there's a beautiful health center that everyone can gather. Those are the things that I want to see for every community across this country for First Nation people. And I can only imagine how their leadership feels when they don't have those things and they're living in poverty and they don't have fresh running water. With the coalition's work, I see the light at the end of the door. And we're going to keep continuing to open that door. And I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to be here to speak with you all today. It's not every day we get an opportunity like this, and I really appreciate the time that you guys have taken to invite us here.
Any other comments? Chief Thomas?
Thank you for your enthusiasm. It is music to my ears and my community's ears to hear that we have the support of your institution in trying to make the change that our people need. And I think what's needed really is to make the change in Canadian society, in how we look at Aboriginal people. You know, gone, I'm hoping, are the days of enemy, you and me, and having that veto and you know, all that PR that hasn't helped our society as a whole. You know, when First Nations do well, the whole region does well. I'd like to see some communication and work on how we're going to change this. I'm not usually one for caution, but I think I really have to question if we're feeling guilty about what we've done before, or we're trying to make it better because, you know, we've got to stop the bleeding. And you know, when we're doing first aid, we do check your airway, breathing, and circulation. So we need to do this with intent and not off wildly, with the well-intentioned intent of trying to make change faster. We're trying to make reparations to a system that has been in place for over 1 century. So I think we need to be doing it stepwise. There are some low-hanging fruit. What Sharleen is talking about is loan guarantee. There's low-hanging fruit there that should be easy. We have meetings set up with various people in the next few days. We're trying to make that change ourselves. It would be helpful if Canada would help us to do that. And I'm tired of being portrayed as somebody that needs rescuing and somebody to be pitied. I'm a strong Aboriginal woman, and please see me like that. And that's the message that I'd like you to help train Canada on as a society. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Patterson, did you have another question?
I appreciate the answers. I do have a quick one, and this is very short term and very practical. The Major Projects Coalition, I understand you've got a growth in your membership. You want to continue your work to build capacity. Are you adequately resourced to meet the needs of your members? Are there challenges in finding the resources to support your work?
So, as you may know, that our funding is going to be ending in March 31st, 2018. And in order for us to continue our work, we are going to need additional support. But this support is going to have to be secured in a way that it's not just through a program. This is something that we want Canadians to take seriously, because this work can help nations across this country and not just in the province of British Columbia. So with that, when we did our original work plan, we submitted that nearly 3 years ago, and we never had any idea of what the growth would become of this organization and what we would experience. But since establishment, the coalition member is now, as you said, 3 times bigger at 37 members, and it's growing in size, and we're gaining interest from nations in Alberta, Ontario, so we see that this has a big impact, and people are generating interest in what we're doing. So to date, we've relied on the program funding provided by the Strategic Partnership Initiative, and the program funding has been challenges in terms of the delivery of the program, the strict guidelines, the cumbersome decision-making process and reporting. That takes a lot of administrative work, and we want to get past that. In order to do that, we're going to have multi-year commitment and funding to be able to do this work. As we heard from Chief Blackwater, getting out a third party and access to resources for their community at no cost can help many lives across this country. and help many leaders in First Nation communities. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, we'll move on to Senator Rain, to be followed by Senator Christmas.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, Mr. Calla, for you to be here and for the First Nation Coalition, Major Projects Coalition, which is showing so much potential. And, you know, I agree that it is